afternoon, and welcome to this next episode of Governance Dialogues. My name is Elisa Cole, and I'm the Managing Director of Governance Center. And as always, I'll be a host for this program today. For those of you who are joining us and who've watched previous episode of Governance Dialogues, you're most welcome. And for new participants in this program, you're most welcome to subscribe to the channel where we host prominent thinkers in the world of governance, be they board members, regulators, or others who have interesting insights to share in the world of governance. As you may know, in the previous dialogue I hosted here, we've featured Pav Gill, who was the whistleblower in the Wirecard case. And in today's episode, it gives me great pleasure to host Jen Sisson, who's the CEO of the International Corporate Governance Network, an association of investors with assets under management, if I'm not mistaken, around 77 trillion US dollars. So it's a really interesting and impressive association. Jen, you're most welcome to this program, and it's a pleasure to have you for this conversation.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Yeah, thrilled to be here. So I'm the new CEO of ICGN, and following in the footsteps of my predecessor, Kerry Waring, who is recently retired. I'm very excited because next year is ICGN's 30th anniversary. So it's a big year for us next year, and we're looking forward to it.
No, it's in fact really very. Your association, the association that you lead, is very prominent in the world of governance, and of course in investing. It's probably the most recognized sort of international investor association in the world, and along with the OECD, perhaps also a prominent standard setter in the area of governance and stewardship. And actually, that's one of the questions that I was hoping to explore with you today on this episode, where I wanted to take a step back from some of the more kind of company-specific discussions we've been having and look at the setting of the governance rules of the game. So who sets them? What are the priorities and what are the challenges? And that's, I think, what we're here to discuss today. But before I jump into these sort of meaty questions for this conversation, I wanted to maybe say a word or two about yourself. And you've been very humble, but you come from a very interesting background, and indeed only recently assumed your responsibilities at ICGN. But I think what makes this conversation in your background obviously very interesting is your combination between kind of private sector stewardship experience, where you've been involved or led initiatives for Goldman Sachs, asset management, and other private sector organizations, but also your experience with the UK FRC, where you participated in the formulation of the UK Stewardship Code and the Corporate Governance Code, which have, like it or not, have led a wave of similar initiatives around the world. So I'll come to that in a second. I think perhaps one place and the most logical place to start is for us to talk about the ICGN corporate governance principles, which have been around, I think, since the last revision was in 2017, if I'm not mistaken. And I want to ask you, what are some of the differentiating features of this instrument vis-a-vis, OECD guidelines, which I'm more very familiar with, having been part of the team, or perhaps other standards that you see in the marketplace that you would consider relevant?
Sure. Well, and so the ICGN global governance principles have been around for a very long time. And really, I think the key thing to think about is what is the purpose of our principles compared to, for example, the OECD guidelines. And while they're aiming to address very similar topics, they do have different purposes, right? So the OECD principles are written for governments to sort of talk about how you could set up frameworks for corporate governance, right? Whereas the ICGN principles are really designed for companies in terms of how they should set up their own governance, and for market participants, for investors, to help guide their thinking around corporate governance. And in fact, many members will use them to inform their proxy voting, for example. So they're aiming in very similar areas, but they do have some differences. And so where some frameworks like the OECD framework are a common denominator that can apply everywhere, ICGN's principles from the perspective of investors are a fairly aspirational standard. They're what we consider to be global best practice in corporate governance. And so it sets the bar somewhat higher as a difference. And so I think, if I was going to pick a couple of specific examples of where it's different. So, for example, the OECD guidelines don't take a particular position on using virtual AGMs, where the ICGN point of view is that hybrid is the best practice model for an AGM, and you should only do a virtual only AGM in very limited circumstances and explain why you're doing so. So I think there are others. For example, the OECD principles suggest that some markets might say have an audit committee as part of their governance frameworks, whereas the ICGN principles would say that it is best practice to always have an audit committee made of independent directors. So I think they are definitely aiming in the same direction, and they're both recognized, for example, as key global reference standards within the EU's CSRD rules, but they do have some nuances that make them a little bit different.
Sure, and I remember, because as you know, I was part of the team that worked on these standards. That indeed in some areas, you're also quite vocal, if I'm not mistaken, on issue of dual voting shares. I mean, there is some, let's say, more leniency, because again, the OECD covers a broad range of jurisdictions that have multiple voting shares. Some, like the US, where the multiples can get quite high, in fact. And I know you've taken a strong stand around these points over the years. But if we kind of look at the evolving governance landscape, and what I'd like to ask you is how you anticipate these different standards evolving in tandem. And of course, the background is that, as you know, the OECD had published the revision of their principles earlier this year, and the guidelines for state-owned companies have just come out a few weeks ago, and we participated in that revision as well. So it'd be interesting to hear, whether the ICGN has a view on what are some of the emerging challenges that you will continue tackling in the forthcoming, let's say, work on the continuous revision of this guideline.
Yeah, I think, standards need to evolve over time, right? And principles need to evolve to reflect what is current best practice. But I think the way I would try and think about it is what we're trying to evolve is the practice of governance. We're not trying to rewrite the standards to take into account sort of new and emerging issues as such, because a good set of principles will apply to whatever the material issues of the day are, right? So we want to have a standard that says, let's consider the material risks, and then let's consider, in the context of those material risks to this company, what is the right thing to do from a governance perspective, rather than trying to sort of tack on, oh, we've thought of a new risk, we better have a new standard. What we're really looking for is a broad framework that continues to evolve. And so I think you're right. The ICGN principles do take a pretty strong stance in a number of areas. So, for example, separation of chair and CEO, absolutely that dual class shares should have a sunset, and ideally that you'd have one share and one vote. And I think those types of things are ahead of many other kind of frameworks around the world, right? Because they are that aspirational standard. So we'd hope that many others will move in that direction as well, and we'll all converge on good practice in the long run.
No, it's most interesting because, in fact, because of the wide sort of membership of the OECD, obviously these standards have to be a little bit,
of course,
accommodating to the different legal regimes that exist around the world. And as we know, in the US and many other countries, these voting shares are allowed. And I've had some interesting conversations with several experts here on the show about the issue of dual class shares, and especially in big tech companies, which is something that we looked at as a big risk. And I think it would be interesting to hear from you, because you sit kind of half on the regulatory side, but also kind of from you look at things from an investor perspective rather than a regulator perspective, as to how you see the effectiveness of all of these initiatives, notably the stewardship codes that have flourished all over the world. UK kind of set up again a wave in that regard, and I think there's a few dozen that now exist around the world. And I think it's a trend that will continue, in a sense that my guess is that we'll see more of them. But I would like to ask you what you make of these initiatives and what you make of their varied success. They're not have not been all met with, or have not all met with equal success, is I guess what I was trying to say.
Yeah, it's interesting. And so I have worked, as you said, at the FRC in the past, and so coming at things from a regulatory perspective, then regulators have one thing that they're trying to do, and our members have, as as investors are trying to operate within those frameworks. But I think, overall, the evolving landscape of stewardship codes around the world in the last, say, 10 years is actually an incredibly positive thing, right? We've seen real increases in the standard of stewardship practice and the stewardship outcomes and activities that stewards of capital are achieving. And we're also seeing kind of real improvements in the transparency of that reporting of those activities over time. So I think, overall, on a total global basis, it is a successful thing, and it continues to grow. Now, of course, all of these codes aren't the same, right? And so some of the codes, so the UK code, for example, the Japanese code, are set by government entities, right? By regulators. They have regulatory backing, and therefore come with some sort of regulatory compulsion, if you like, for people to comply with them. So, for example, in the UK, under the Financial Conduct Authority's rules for asset managers are required to either become a signatory to the UK Stewardship Code or make an alternative statement of whatever their different stewardship approach is, right? Which inevitably drives some adoption, which then makes it kind of become a market mechanism, right? And the asset owners are able to use the Stewardship Code reporting to engage with their asset managers on what they're doing, and it becomes that sort of cycle, which is one thing that I think helps. The other thing that makes the UK code a bit different than others is that it has this oversight mechanism, right? So you sign up, but you have to report every year, and the FRC is going to make an assessment of whether or not you've met the criteria. So that's quite different than some other codes that might be, say, set by an industry organization or might be set by some kind of other voluntary group that people will commit to, but that there's no necessary enforcement mechanism or there's no oversight. And so they kind of all fulfilling slightly different roles. And I think that's okay. Much like there's different kinds of governance frameworks, there's different kinds of stewardship codes. And interestingly, the ICGN has a set of global stewardship principles, which are, again, they're principles. They're not really a code in the sense that people don't have to sign up to them. It's used as a framework to say, what do we think the principles of best practices in stewardship are? And we use that to inform our advocacy work, and we use it to help our members to think about what they might want to do. And they set out really what we believe is an international aspirational framework for what investors could be doing in stewardship. So lots of our members do publicly endorse them. But again, it's a little bit different than the UK code, right? They're not writing a report based on the ICGN principles. So I think, overall, we've seen lots of positive change. It's worth noting, though, that there's going to be a number of stewardship code revisions coming, notably in the UK and in Japan. And so I think we're likely to see some efforts to drive a bit of simplification, particularly to kind of try and reduce some of the reporting burden, which I think would be positive, largely because, the landscape has shifted dramatically in the last few years and the types of regulatory reporting that asset managers are doing in this space. So, we want to make sure that we're really focusing on what matters.
And Jen, there is a country that you mentioned twice in your comments now, which is Japan. And I think the UK progress on the stewardship code is quite well, perhaps followed and known. But Japan is one of those countries that is perhaps less well understood, at least in my view, particularly from a governance perspective. And it has had, if we look at comparative assessments by the OECD, some kind of pretty obvious challenges, for example, on board diversity issues, on some other kind of disclosure issues. And some recent corporate battles have also kind of highlighted that. And I know that ICGN has been doing quite a lot of work in Japan recently, and you mentioned this forthcoming revision of the stewardship code. I wonder if you could perhaps walk us through Japan as being one example where the ICGN has actually been involved quite heavily, it seems to me. What challenges do you see, and how do you address kind of the complex, also cultural elements of the governance debate there? Because we cannot ultimately dissociate regulations from human behavior. So we're kind of have to consider these two elements in tandem, I think.
Yes. Well, so I would say ICGN has been extremely active and involved in Japan for a very long time. It's not a recent thing as such. We have, however, seen quite a bit of progress in Japan recently, and so we should be very much acknowledging of that. And it's a really interesting case study in terms of how kind of really good long-term engagement can work. So ICGN and our members have been engaging with the government, with regulators, with other policymakers to seek to drive change in Japan for some time. And the first stage of governance reform, which resulted in the governance and stewardship codes in Japan, really, I think, has started to bear some fruit, and we're seeing quite a lot of positive change in a number of areas, and that continues to grow. So you may have seen earlier this year that Prime Minister Kishida signaled very strong support for the next phase of corporate governance reform, particularly in this instance on the timing of disclosures by companies. So while we've seen some good progress, there's definitely some areas to focus on. And sort of how have we done that? It's partly through relationship building. I think it's to do with really consistently responding to requests for input. One of the great benefits of ICGN is to bring that global international view of what is best practice, but also the global investment community, right? What is it that we think we'd like to see different? And bringing those people together in meetings and discussions and in several in-person and virtual events over a long period of time really has helped to converge and to grow that knowledge. But look, I think it's absolutely right that there's more to do, and we will stay engaged, and we are very focused at the moment on a few issues. One being the timing of company disclosures, and particularly that companies should really be making their annual report or their YuHo disclosures before their AGM. So there's many companies in Japan who will have their AGM before they've published their annual report. And clearly that doesn't give investors as much information as they'd ideally have in order to exercise those rights. Similarly, we'd like to see those disclosures made very consistently in English as well as in Japanese, just to improve, again, that access and ability for international investors to engage. The other one is, thinking about cross-shareholdings. So we've been advocating for better disclosure of the rationale for cross-shareholdings, and we do see some disclosures there. But really, I think we're going to be moving towards seeing companies wind down those positions over time. And then the other thing that's interesting in Japan, and we have a virtual Japan forum in September where we're going to be trying to grapple with some of these issues, is how do we really land some of the behaviors and make stewardship engagement, for example, really work well. So, and there's some cultural element to this for sure. And we see this in different parts of the world, right? But how do we get investors and companies, board members, to be having sort of fruitful engagement conversations, understanding, that really engagement is about trying to drive outcomes.
Interesting. And I'm listening to you and I'm thinking about the various markets in which you operate. Obviously, kind of Europe, North America, and Japan are three markets where ICGN members have traditionally sort of come from. And I know that you've been also recently engaging in sort of new territories, at least for the ICGN. You recently had a meeting, one of the first meetings in Dubai, and perhaps there are broader ideas of working in the Middle East or other kind of regions that are booming from a financial perspective. I think Saudi Arabia was rated as the highest market by issuance last year. And of course, we see the shifts in capital flows, and we're also, as you know, quite active in these markets, notably in Saudi. So I wonder if you could say a few words around how you see these different practices, so different regions, the new regions, the up and coming regions, developing from a governance point of view. What are some of the challenges that you see there from a stewardship perspective, for example? Because we know that investors do have some challenges in these markets. And if you look at, for example, disclosure by the likes of Vanguard or BlackRock or whatnot, we still see that, even compared to their own voting policies, they don't necessarily always vote against certain proposals, although they're starting to. So I just wonder if you have thoughts on that front.
Gosh, well, I don't know that I'm going to have comments on individual asset managers voting. So just we'll be clear on that. But I think, look, theoretically, what is good about the way that ICGN thinks about it from a kind of governance frameworks perspective, is that we're setting a global benchmark of what we think is good practice, right? And we're absolutely aware that there's a whole bunch of different frameworks around the world and different ways that this works, right? So actually, the structure of corporate governance in Germany is pretty different than it is in France, right? But you can still have a thoughtful discussion about what are good practices. And similarly, in markets like the Middle East, where we were thrilled to have a conference last year, it's brilliant to be having these discussions and to be able to help shape that evolution over time, because really, capital is global, right? And good governance is kind of fundamentally good governance. And so we want to be respectful of local market issues and think about how to adapt where necessary. But really what we'd like to see is overall standards increasing everywhere. So you're absolutely right that it's an interesting question of where next, right? Where do you go to try and keep that level of influence and advocacy up and in new markets? And we actually have been having some new members join us from different parts of the world, and we'd love to be doing more on behalf of our existing and any new members to engage in different markets. But I think it comes to, if you're in a market where disclosure is weak, then you've got to start with good disclosure. If you're in a market where perhaps diversity or independence is a challenge, those are things to work on. And so it all comes back really to, much like having one framework that suits, whatever the various material risks are, I think having one sort of guiding set of principles of what does good governance look like really helps us there.
Okay. Well, it's interesting also about different organizations and kind of the growth of ICGN and different organizations joining you from new regions, and perhaps you kind of branching out to different frontiers. And in all transparency and disclosure, we've also joined as governance center the ICGN and encourage others to do so. And you were mentioning, but I'll repeat that that ICGN is having its annual conference in about a month's time, just a little bit more.
That's right, in London.
In London. So I think it would be an interesting occasion to pursue this conversation. But before we break off for today, there's one kind of more kind of corporate level question that I wanted to ask, because we've been speaking until now about rules and regulations, stewardship codes, and kind of more regulatory framework type questions, which is the primary objective of our conversation. But if you look at the world and kind of the headlines we see in the financial press all over the world, the kind of cases we're seeing, whether it's whistleblowing cases and dilemmas at Boeing, and we, as I mentioned, discussed another whistleblowing case, which was Wirecard, which in a previous episode, but other cases we're seeing where there's serious kind of proxy fights going on between investors and whether it's ExxonMobil, Facebook, Amazon, Disney, around the whole disclosure of how Disney uses AI. What do you make of these kind of investor fights and what investors are looking for, and whether the existing frameworks are actually allowing them to properly voice their concerns? That would be my perhaps last kind of question to you today.
Well, so that's a very big question, which I think it's probably helpful to think about a little bit. Is what you've listed there is a whole bunch of different types of issues, right? So we've got some straight up proxy fights, right? Like we're going to try and replace the directors. We've got a whole series of shareholder proposals. And then we've got this question around whether or not companies should be able to sue to have shareholder proposals removed from the ballot rather than using the SEC no action process, right? So those are actually a big range of different shareholder rights related issues. But I think, what it specifically points to is how important it is that shareholders and investors are able to be active stewards and are able to exercise their rights and to consider these very complex issues and try and take the action that they believe is in the best interests of their clients and beneficiaries. And protecting that right to vote is absolutely critical. And so ICGN remains supportive of the SEC no action process. We think that is a good mechanism to determine getting shareholder proposals on the ballot, and clearly there's some concerns about this move towards litigation. as a route, getting away from those fundamental rights that we believe shareholders should be able to avail themselves of under the appropriate law. But this isn't just a US issue. We're actually seeing some challenges to shareholder rights all around the world. Another good example would be here some of the changes that have been proposed here in the UK to the listing rules that would allow for the removal of sunset clauses on dual class shares, removal of votes on significant M&A transactions or related party transactions. And we really do oppose those, and we think it's important that we maintain the rights of the shareholders who own the companies to exercise those rights and hold managements and boards accountable. In Italy, the Capital Markets Bill now allows companies to appoint a designated representative at their AGM of all shareholders and otherwise have essentially a closed-door meeting. Clearly, that's a worrying trend and disenfranchises shareholders from their ability to fully participate in those meetings. So we definitely want to be focused on making sure that shareholder rights and access are protected, that shareholders are able to exercise those stewardship rights. And, it's really just fundamental governance principles, right? Companies should report transparently and in a timely way to their shareholders. One share should ideally be one vote. And, shareholders need to be able to actively and fairly participate in AGMs. And I think, we would definitely be focusing on these as among other issues in the coming months and years, because we think they're absolutely crucial.
No, thank you, John. I think they're really interesting examples. And I know that in terms of the UK, they're trying to eliminate to basically have dual class shares in the UK, or having notably this issue with the related party transactions or reporting, which also came up a couple of years ago. You also kind of were very vocal as the ICGN against the idea that there would be a watering down of the related party transaction rules as part of the tier 1 listing on the UK stock exchange, and that kind of basically ended that story. Actually, the rules were maintained, so that was a clear victory, and I hope that there will be other victories going forward. And we have been discussing for our viewers also this issue of the shareholder rights in the context of specific companies. For those of you who are more interested to kind of delve into company-specific case studies, which we didn't have time to address at length today, we had a conversation on this program with Rick Alexander, who's the CEO of Shareholder Commons, to talk about, I think it was the Facebook case, and there are a number of other kind of more specific discussions that we've had over time. But I think for the purpose of this conversation, which I think has been fascinating and was meant by intentionally meant to address more sort of rules of the game in the governance space, I really thought it was really insightful and interesting to hear about what battles you're waging and where you see the priorities lying going forward.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and certainly encourage people to take a look at the ICGN website, consider coming along to our events. We've one in London this year, one in Melbourne later this year, and then there'll be a great program of events next year for our 30th anniversary. So we'd love to see lots of people there.
Yes, I was going to say I also look forward to seeing you in July. And for those of you who are interested, we'll put links to both ICGN kind of program and principles, which we've been discussing in this episode, as well as some of our work that links to global rules of the game as far as governance is concerned, in the description of this episode. And please feel free to subscribe and join us for future conversations with thought leaders. Thank you for your time and attention today.